Ukraine and Russia share deep historical and cultural ties. For centuries, their fates were intertwined. Both nations trace their roots back to the East Slavic civilization. Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, was once a center of power for the early Slavic state known as Kievan Rus. Over time, their paths diverged. Ukraine experienced periods of rule by Lithuania, Poland, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Russia, meanwhile, grew into a vast empire. Despite these different trajectories, Ukraine and Russia remained connected. The Russian Empire absorbed large parts of Ukraine, incorporating them into its territory. Later, under Soviet rule, Ukraine became a republic within the USSR. However, Ukrainian identity persisted. Language, culture, and a desire for self-determination continued to burn bright. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 gave Ukraine a chance to chart its own course. It declared independence, a decision confirmed by a referendum in which the majority of Ukrainians voted to leave the Soviet Union. This newfound independence did not erase the complexities of the Ukraine-Russia relationship. Russia found it difficult to accept Ukraine's westward leanings. Ukraine's desire to join the European Union and NATO further fueled tensions. Russia saw these aspirations as a direct threat to its own security and influence. The stage was set for a confrontation that would have far-reaching consequences. The year 2014 marked a turning point in the relationship between Ukraine and Russia. What began as pro-democracy protests in Ukraine quickly escalated into a geopolitical crisis. In November 2013, then Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, under pressure from Moscow, refused to sign an association agreement with the European Union. This decision ignited mass demonstrations in Kyiv known as the Euromaidan protests. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians took to the streets demanding closer ties with Europe and an end to corruption. The protests turned violent as government forces cracked down on demonstrators. Scores of people were killed, and the world watched in horror. Yanukovych fled to Russia, and a new pro-Western government came to power in Kyiv. Russia, fearing a loss of influence in its near abroad, responded swiftly and decisively. In February 2014, Russian forces seized control of the Crimean Peninsula, a Ukrainian territory with a majority Russian population. A hastily organized referendum, widely condemned as illegitimate by the international community, paved the way for Russia's annexation of Crimea. The crisis deepened as Russia fanned the flames of separatism in eastern Ukraine. Pro-Russian separatists, backed by Russian troops and weapons, launched a rebellion in the Donbas region, comprising the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. A brutal conflict erupted, claiming thousands of lives and displacing millions. The 2014 events in Ukraine sent shockwaves throughout the world. They shattered the post-Cold War order and ushered in a new era of geopolitical rivalry and uncertainty. The world watched in disbelief as, on February 24, 2022, Russian forces launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin's stated goals were the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, claims widely dismissed as baseless pretexts for an unprovoked war of aggression. The invasion sent shockwaves across the globe, drawing condemnation from world leaders and triggering unprecedented sanctions against Russia. Russian troops advanced on Ukraine from multiple fronts, targeting key cities including Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Odessa. The invasion was met with fierce resistance from Ukrainian forces and ordinary citizens who took up arms to defend their country. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky emerged as a symbol of defiance, rallying his people and garnering international support. Contrary to Russian expectations of a swift victory, the invasion became bogged down in a bloody and protracted conflict. Ukraine's defense, bolstered by Western military aid, proved surprisingly resilient. The use of sophisticated weapons systems such as Javelin anti-tank missiles and Turkish-made Bayraktar drones inflicted heavy losses on Russian forces. Russia's invasion of Ukraine marked a turning point in 21st century history. It shattered the illusion of peace in Europe and raised profound questions about the future of international order. The conflict has had a devastating impact on Ukraine, with millions displaced and countless lives lost. The world watched in horror as the conflict unfolded, with no end in sight. As 2023 progressed, the war in Ukraine settled into a grim stalemate. Neither side achieved a decisive victory, and the conflict devolved into a war of attrition. The front lines remained largely static, with both sides digging in and fortifying their positions. The fighting was particularly intense in the Donbas region, where Russian forces, supported by separatist militias, continued their relentless assault on Ukrainian positions. The city of Bakhmut became a focal point of the fighting, with both sides suffering heavy casualties in the battle for control of the strategically insignificant town. The stalemate did not mean an end to the bloodshed. Artillery duels, missile strikes, and drone attacks continued to claim lives and destroy infrastructure. The human cost of the war was immeasurable. Millions of Ukrainians were displaced from their homes, seeking refuge in neighboring countries or within Ukraine itself. The global implications of the war were profound. The conflict disrupted supply chains, fueled inflation, and exacerbated food shortages in many parts of the world. The war also heightened geopolitical tensions, leading to a new Cold War between Russia and the West. The stalemate in Ukraine became a symbol of a world grappling with uncertainty and the specter of a protracted conflict with no easy solutions. Section 5 Escalation, pushing the limits in 2024 to 2025. The year 2024 witnessed a dangerous escalation in the Ukraine conflict. Frustrated by the stalemate on the battlefield, both sides resorted to increasingly risky tactics. Ukraine, emboldened by its successful defense and growing Western support, stepped up its drone attacks inside Russian territory. Targets included fuel depots, air bases, and military installations, aiming to disrupt Russia's war effort and undermine its morale. Russia responded in kind, launching waves of missile and drone attacks against Ukrainian cities and critical infrastructure. The attacks caused widespread power outages, disrupted essential services, and terrorized the civilian population. Adding to the volatility, Russia began deploying North Korean-supplied ballistic missiles and Iranian-made drones, escalating the technological sophistication of the conflict. In a move that shocked the world, Ukraine launched a bold offensive in the Kursk region in late 2024. For the first time, Ukrainian ground forces crossed into internationally recognized Russian territory, aiming to capture territory and increase pressure on Moscow. The escalation raised fears of a wider conflict as NATO members watched nervously for signs of Russian retaliation against alliance territory. April 2025 dawned with a series of grim reminders of the war's devastating impact. On April 4th, a Russian missile strike on the central Ukrainian city of Kyiv killed 19 people, including 9 children, shocking the world with its brutality. Just 2 days later, on April 6th, Kyiv was targeted in a coordinated drone and missile attack, damaging buildings and injuring civilians. Mykolaiv, a port city in southern Ukraine, also came under fire on April 6th, adding to the growing list of civilian casualties. Ukraine responded with a series of strikes of its own, targeting a suspected Russian explosives facility in Samara, deep inside Russian territory. The attack caused massive explosions and fires, highlighting the expanding geographical scope of the conflict. As the fighting raged on, diplomatic efforts struggled to gain traction. Ukrainian President Zelensky reiterated his willingness to negotiate with Russia, but remained insistent on Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. The war in Ukraine has deeply divided the international community. On one side, the United States, the European Union, and their allies have condemned Russia's aggression and imposed unprecedented sanctions on Moscow. They have provided Ukraine with billions of dollars in military and humanitarian aid, becoming crucial lifelines for the embattled nation. A coalition of the willing, comprising the United Kingdom, France, and 29 other nations, has pledged to support Ukraine's post-war reconstruction and is actively preparing for peacekeeping operations should a peace agreement be reached. On the other side, Russia has found support from countries like China, India, Iran, and North Korea. These nations have provided Moscow with economic and diplomatic lifelines, helping it weather the storm of Western sanctions. The United Nations has struggled to find common ground on the issue, with Russia using its veto power in the Security Council to block resolutions condemning its actions. While UN Resolution 2774 calling for peace in Ukraine was adopted, it lacked specific mechanisms for enforcement and failed to bridge the deep divisions within the international community. The war in Ukraine has exposed the limitations of the current global order and highlighted the challenges of addressing international crises in a multipolar world. The war in Ukraine has come at a steep price for all involved. Ukraine, the victim of unprovoked aggression, has borne the brunt of the suffering. Its economy has been devastated, its infrastructure shattered, and its people traumatized. The human cost of the war is immeasurable, with countless lives lost and millions displaced. Russia, despite its initial military superiority, has also paid a heavy price. Western sanctions have crippled its economy, isolated it on the world stage, and fueled internal dissent. The war has exposed weaknesses in the Russian military and eroded its international standing. The global economy has been significantly impacted. Supply chain disruptions, energy shortages, and rising inflation have affected countries worldwide. The war has also exacerbated food insecurity, particularly in developing nations that rely on grain imports from Ukraine and Russia. The conflict has led to a massive influx of refugees into neighboring countries, straining resources and testing social cohesion. The long-term consequences of the war, both for the region and the world, remain uncertain. As the war in Ukraine grinds on, the path ahead remains fraught with uncertainty. Diplomatic efforts to find a negotiated settlement have yielded little progress. Both sides remain entrenched in their positions, with no clear end to the fighting in sight. The risk of further escalation looms large. The use of tactical nuclear weapons, while unlikely, cannot be entirely ruled out, particularly if Russia senses an existential threat. Accidental clashes between NATO and Russian forces, while unintentional, could escalate into a wider conflict with catastrophic consequences. The resilience of the Ukrainian people and their determination to defend their homeland offer a glimmer of hope. International support for Ukraine, while not without its challenges, has remained steadfast. The possibility of a negotiated settlement, however difficult, remains the only viable path to ending the bloodshed and preventing further suffering. The war in Ukraine stands as a stark reminder of the fragility of peace and the devastating consequences of unchecked aggression. It is a conflict that will shape the geopolitical landscape for years to come.